Hello, my name is Stephanie Johnson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Nelson, and welcome, and thank you for coming and being here today.
Wonderful.
So we're actually going to start our program today with introductions of individuals that are here. We're going to introduce the Gallaudet University president, Dr. Alan Hurwitz, and our provost, Stephen Weiner. And we'd like to have them. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's a very exciting time for all of us. We have a wonderful opportunity today to listen to a presentation by Mr. Tim Wise called Slavery, Emancipation, and the Residual Impact of Slavery on the African American Community Today. And this event is in honor of the 150th anniversary of the D.C. Emancipation Compensatory Act of 1862. This act freed slaves in D.C. and marked the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. The District of Columbia is marking this pivotal event with a year-long celebration. We thank the District of Columbia for including Gallaudet University in this historic milestone. Before the speech, I'd like to say that Gallaudet University is a welcoming community for all people who study, work, and visit our beautiful campus. We are very pleased to welcome Mr. Wise here today. I'd also like to recognize that November is Native American Indian Heritage Month. After Mr. Wise's presentation, be sure to remain here and enjoy the awards ceremony for Clare Center and Gallaudet students who participated in an essay, multimedia, and poster contest in honor of this important anniversary. Thank you. And if I could invite Dr. Weiner to the stage. Good afternoon, everyone. Before coming here, I was looking at an old book of mine called Slavery to Freedom. It was a required reading in my school many years ago, and it was written by a very prominent professor at Duke University, John Hope Franklin. And from that book, I learned several things that remain with me even today, and I hope that you all can also think of these things as we listen to our presentation today and we think about the anniversary of emancipation. But we were a slave-holding country for twice as long as we were a free country. So 1607, Jamestown, and before that, 1500 in Central America and beyond. Slavery had been in existence for 300 years before we're hitting this mark of 150 years. So keep that in mind as we move along in our event today. And in our history books, especially our American history books and what we've learned in school, there are specifics there, but there are many things that are unexplained and yet to be discovered in American history. And Mr. Wise's presentation is one example of us learning those uncharted, undiscovered areas that we're still learning about ourselves as Americans here in the United States. I want to thank you all for coming and enjoy.
And good afternoon to everyone and welcome. This event took almost an entire year of planning. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize the committee members for their unfailing dedication and work for this event. We're celebrating the sesquicentennial. So those persons who are on that committee for the Gallaudet celebration, please stand. We want them to be recognized for the great work that they have done. I would also like to thank the Gallaudet University Museum Committee as well, under Dr. Jane Norman's directorship. If the members of that committee can also stand as well. That's Dr. Jane Norman. We also have from the Office of Special Rehabilitation and Special Education Services, Annette Reichman. And we have the Office of the Special Institutional Director as well, and that is Annette Reichman, and we would like those committee members to also stand. We also have Mallory Smith with us today, who founded the Deaf Women's, Marilyn Smith, correction, with us today, who founded the Deaf Women's Advocacy Organization. We also have a representative from our pre-college program at the Clear Center, and also from MSSD. If those members can please stand, the Clerk Center and the students who are visiting us today. I would also like to welcome the parents of the Clear Center students who actually participated in the contest. So if the parents can please stand and be recognized as well. I would also like to thank the Office of the President and the Provost for their steadfast support and encouragement for this event to happen. It has been truly wonderful, so I'd like to thank the two of you individually. I would also like to introduce our two MCs for this afternoon, Ms. Stephanie Johnson and also Alex Nelson. These students will be the MCs for today's program, and also welcome to Mr. Stephanie. This is such an exciting time, isn't it?
We are so excited, and we forgot to tell you initially that we're both students here at Gallaudet. We're graduate students, and we have been working with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Office of Diversity and Equity, and we want to thank all of the MSSD and Clare Center students for being here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Tim Wise. He is considered as one of the most brilliant, articulate, and courageous critics of white privilege in the nation. Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He graduated from Tulane University in 1990 and received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and beyond. This institute is located in New Orleans. Mr. Wise is also the author of 6 books. His latest, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority, examines rising white anxiety in an increasingly multicultural nation. Mr. Wise has provided anti-racism training to teachers nationwide and has conducted trainings with physicians and the medical industry professionals on how to combat racial inequities in healthcare. He has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, military, and law enforcement officials on methods of dismantling racism in their institutions. And he has served as a consultant for plaintiffs' attorneys in federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington State.
Would you mind holding this for me? Mr. Wise has diligently worked in various settings to combat inequities. He has vast experience in university settings as well. He was a former adjunct faculty member at Smith College, teaching in the School of Social Work, master's level courses. And he taught a class called Racism in the United States. He was also a visiting faculty in residence at the Poynter Institute in Florida, where he trained journalists to eliminate racial bias in reporting. He is an advisor to Fisk University Race Relations Institute in Tennessee. Mr. Wise was recently named one of the 25 visionaries who are changing your world. By Utune Reader. Utne Reader. He has spoken in 49 states on over 600 colleges and campuses and groups across the nation and internationally in Canada and Bermuda on issues of comparative racism, race and education, race and religion, and racism in the labor market. We are honored to have such a brilliant social change agent here with us on Gallaudet University's campus. Please help us welcome Mr. Tim Wise.
A history that is quite negative and in many ways quite evil as well. And so because it is important for us to address the entire past, not only the past that makes us feel good, I am especially glad to be here today. It's odd in a way that even though the Emancipation Act in D.C. and more broadly the larger emancipation of enslaved persons is something about which the nation can be and should be proud, that in spite of that, because addressing and thinking about emancipation requires that we remember the thing from which people were being emancipated, so many folks would rather us leave this to the history books, would rather us dump it into the memory hole, never to be resurrected for our consideration. They will say things like, well, now that was a long time ago. Why do we have to talk about that today? Why can't we just leave that in the past? But this is coming from some of the very same people who were the first to go to the 4th of July parade, which, after all, is also a rather old historical reference. And it's a day about which they don't seem to have any problem celebrating, in spite of the fact that it's well over 230 years in the past. You see, they like the past when it's the pretty part of the past. They just don't like the past when it's the not so pretty part. And so any mention of the historical crimes of our country and what they mean for us today, any mention of that brings forth cries of hostility from those who prefer the shiny, happy version of America. I always knew this was true, but frankly, this last July 4th, this last Independence Day, I learned it again in a very new and somewhat humorous but also disturbing way. And so on July 4th of this year, I happened to be on Twitter that morning having coffee, having some breakfast, and I saw this tweet that I thought was really funny, but apparently an awful lot of other people did not think that it was funny. It was a tweet from Chris Rock, and because he is a stand-up comedian, of course, it was rather humorous, and I thought it was perfect for the day, right? What Chris Rock said on July 4th was this. He said, "Happy White People's Independence Day." And he went on, which I thought, I mean, he could have stopped right there, and that would have been really funny. But he went on, and he said, "The slaves weren't free, but I'm sure they enjoyed the fireworks," which is also pretty funny. Now, all Chris Rock was saying, really, in that 140-character burst of energy, right, was we don't all see history the same way, right? And we don't see it the same way because we haven't lived it the same way. We haven't experienced the country the same way. It's really the same thing that Frederick Douglass said well over 150 years ago in his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in which he made basically the same argument that Chris Rock was making. Granted, Frederick Douglass made it in a little bit prettier and more prose-worthy way rather than a 140-character tweet, you know. Speeches were a bit more eloquent, I suppose, 150 years ago than what we do today online. But the message was basically the same. The message was, you have your historical memory, and by God, I have my historical memory, and they aren't the same. Now, one would think that these very simple words from Chris Rock wouldn't really be that controversial, because after all, what he was saying was true. July 4th simply didn't mean the same to black folk. It certainly didn't mean the same to indigenous native North American peoples as it meant to white folks. And to be honest, it didn't mean the same to white women that it meant to white men, and it didn't mean the same to poor folks without land that it meant to rich folks with lots of land. I mean, obviously, there are many different ways of remembering that era. But apparently, there were a lot of folks who received Chris Rock's Twitter feed who weren't at all happy about what Chris Rock said. And one individual in particular really summed up for me the all too common and very disturbing way in which certain members of the white American community respond to any discussion about racism at all, right? Any discussion of racism past or present. This is how too many white folks respond. It was an individual from South Carolina who fashions himself to be some type of conservative blogger online, but actually he makes his money in his day job as a divorce attorney. So, you know, I suppose one has to do what one has to do, even as one defends family values from those of us who ostensibly would destroy them. But in any event, this blogger, who I'll call Jeff because that's his name, Jeff Schreiber, actually, is his name. Jeff was very upset at Chris Rock, and so he tweeted back. Now, first lesson, and if you don't learn anything else today, this would probably be the thing to learn. You should never get in a Twitter war with a stand-up comedian. Because it is not going to go well for you. And it did not go well for Jeff. So Jeff responds, and he, you know how you do on Twitter, you have the hashtag and whatever you want to say that you're hoping people will then follow throughout the day. So his hashtag was, and I'm going to clean it up and make it a G-rated version of what Jeff said. His version was quite a bit more R-rated, but what he said was hashtag go F yourself, which I'm assuming is language he learned in divorce court among some of his clients who probably speak that way to one another in the midst of their divorce. So Jeff says, go F yourself, and then he goes on to say, slavery existed for 2,000 years before America. We ended it in 100 years, and now we have a black president. Right? So there, basically, is what Jeff was saying to Chris Rock, replying to a historically accurate statement made by Chris Rock with a totally irrelevant rebuttal that has nothing to do with anything, but is the way that oftentimes white folks respond to any discussion about racism. Essentially, think about what Jeff said. Let's break it down into three parts. The first thing he says is the old "they did it too" defense, right? Well, yes, we enslaved other human beings, but you know, other countries also did that, and they did it for 2,000 years, so really, you can't blame us. Now, let's think about this defense for a minute. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I remember trying to use this defense with my mother. On one particular occasion when I had managed, with the help of a friend, to break a window in a neighboring apartment playing baseball. And I remember going to my mother after I was in pretty big trouble for breaking this window and saying something to the effect of, well, you know, it wasn't just me playing baseball. Billy was also throwing the ball, so it's also his fault. Now, as I remember, and you may or may not have had a similar experience, my mother looked at me and said something about Billy and a bridge, and whether, if young William were to throw himself from that bridge, whether I would, in the manner of a damn fool, follow him. Which is to say, she wasn't very impressed by the fact that someone else had been in on the breaking of the window, just like I don't think we ought to be impressed by the fact that throughout human history, people have injured other people. And therefore, we need not deal with the injury that we have helped to perpetrate or from which we have in some way as a nation benefited. But that was his first line of defense. We don't need to talk about that because they did it too. The second aspect of his tweet is that we ended slavery in 100 years, which always leads me to ask when others use the word we to describe something, just who is the we that you're talking about? Because the truth is, those who were the conservative activists of the slavery era certainly were not in on that work. Right? They were not the ones who were the abolitionists or the emancipationists. Yes, the Republican Party of those days was the abolitionist party. They were the party more given to emancipation, but conservatives of their day, which is what Jeff is today, right, were the ones trying to preserve the traditional institution of enslavement. And so Jeff can say all he wishes that we ended slavery, but now some people ended it, and a lot of other people just sat around and defended it. And I feel confident that if Jeff had been alive 150 years ago, where he would have sat in that particular conflict. The third thing he says, and this is the funniest of all, he says, now we have a black president. Okay, I am very confident that Jeff had no part in making that happen. I mean, I read his blog. I know that he had nothing to do with that, but he'll take credit for it. if it will get him out of a conversation about the historical crime of enslavement. We now have a black president. Yes, the same black president whose election, not once but twice, has now apparently provoked an outpouring of racist hostility, whether it is in the form of racist emails or racist signs at rallies that have been seen both here in Washington and around the country over the last 4 years, or the racist protests that erupted just last week at the University of Mississippi and also at Hampton-Sydney, or the racist tweets and claims that it would be a good thing were the president to be assassinated that we've seen going around the internet. We have 30 states, you may or may not have seen this, but 30 states now where individuals in the last week have petitioned the United States government for the right to secede from the Union because Barack Obama was reelected. I mean, this is taking sore losing to an entirely new level beyond anything that I have ever witnessed before. Because this man who you didn't support wins re-election, you wish to secede from the Union? If black folks threatened to secede from the Union every time an election had not gone their way, they would have left a long damn time ago. But apparently folks like Mr. Jeff in South Carolina and others believe that this new multicultural, multiracial, very different America from the one that they grew up in and prefer is somehow a dangerous, dangerous destruction of all that we hold dear in our American tradition. Well, some of those traditions are dear, and some of those traditions are worth preserving. But an awful lot of them, like the 200-plus year period of enslavement that emancipation brought to an end, was certainly not among those traditions that were worth preserving. And so we come together today to talk about that, not because we wish to stay in the past, right? Peoples of color, as much as anyone, more than anyone, do not wish to stay in the past. But those who have been the targets of oppression in history understand, perhaps far better than the rest of us, that history is mightily important, is critical for us to remember, so that we do not, in fact, repeat the mistakes of that history. And of course, let us be honest, just because this nation has made progress, and just because this nation has elected now not once but twice a black man as president of the United States, does not tell us anything in and of itself about the larger issues of institutional racial inequality. How do we know that? Well, I could spend literally a semester of academic life demonstrating it to you with data and facts and figures and statistics. It wouldn't be very hard to prove, and I'm sure you have professors here who talk about those things and demonstrate those things every day in class. But beyond that, we don't even have to look at the data to know that. All we have to do is think of an analogy that would help prove the point. And so, for instance, this idea that the election of a man of color somehow signifies the death of racism as a force in America doesn't make any more sense than it would make to say that the election of a woman, Benazir Bhutto, in Pakistan, she was elected in 1988 and again in 1991. No one would say that her election meant that sexism had been eradicated in Pakistan, that somehow the mistreatment of women was no longer there just because a woman had been elected. So too, women have been elected as the head of state in Israel and India and Great Britain and the Philippines and several other places, not here yet, right? But if I were to say to the women in this room, if I were to say to my own two daughters who are 11 and 9 years of age, you know, what you really ought to do is pack your bags and move to Pakistan, so that you will now have equal opportunity. I'm assuming that every woman in here, and even my 9-year-old daughter who knows nothing about Pakistan, would still say, no, Daddy, no, that's not a good idea at all. Because we understand in those cases that the individual at the top of the political power structure does not necessarily tell us much about the larger structure. So if in this country we have approximately 90 million peoples of color overall, the fact that the most powerful political player in that country is a person of color does not tell you much about the rest of that 90 million, right? Because there are approximately 90 million black folks in this country whose names are neither Barack Obama nor Oprah Winfrey, and whose lives do not necessarily mirror the lives of those individuals who have obtained those high positions of authority. So we have to dig deeper if we really want to understand the legacy of the Emancipation Act, and more to the point, the legacy of the enslavement that made it necessary. The reason we talk about this, and not just in a history class, is because the past comes into the present. The past affects the present. Back in 3rd or 4th grade science class, I remember learning about, and you probably did too, this concept of inertia, right? The idea that an object in motion will tend to continue in the same direction, right, in motion until it is stopped by a force of equal or greater power to prevent it from continuing on its way. So if you roll a rock down a hill, it's going to keep going until the hill ends or it runs into a wall or something, right? That's inertia. But inertia is not just a physical property, you see. It's not just a property of the physical universe. Inertia is, in a very real sense, also a property of the political universe. It is a property of the economic universe. So those things which happen in one generation will affect the next generation and the next generation and the next generation until, like that rock, they come up against a force of equal or greater weight to push against it, you see. And although we have had those counterweights at various points in our history, those forces that pushed against that inertia, there is no way that we can look around and actually believe that those counter forces have been adequate to reverse the effects of that history. Let us talk about the 2 ways in which this legacy continues into the 21st century. First, there is the material inequality, the economic inequalities of the present era, which directly stem from that long legacy of racial oppression, including enslavement, but also segregation and other forms of discrimination. That material inequality begins historically in the era of enslavement at a time when white folks, and only white folks, were able to first be considered citizens. That was the decision of the United States Congress, the very first law that the Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified. The very first thing that they did before they did anything else was pass a law called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what the Naturalization Act of 1790 said, among other things, was that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. In other words, only they were really deserving of the rights and the liberties granted in the Constitution. That was the law of the land. It gave those of us who were white, or our ancestors, preferential treatment. It was a form of affirmative action if we were using honest language, but we didn't use that honest language a couple hundred years ago, right? Affirmative action is what we think of when we do anything to try to level the playing field. But why wasn't that affirmative action for those who were white, particularly white property-owning men? Right? Because it was a form of preference. And white folks, as a result of that preference, were able to accumulate stuff, were able to accumulate land and money, and of course, other human beings in far too many cases, at a time when peoples of color were being routinely blocked from being able to accumulate land and property. And when you're not allowed in the first generation to accumulate property, you can't do what? You can't hand down that property to one's children or grandchildren. And so what becomes a small inequality perhaps in the first generation, by the third or the fourth generation, after that property has cycled down through the generations, now that inequality gets even bigger, right? Because the thing about wealth and property is it tends to accumulate value very quickly, right? Because of interest, right? If you own land or you have money in the bank, interest means that that's going to grow at a much faster rate than just money itself in your pocket, right? So over time, that first, that second, that third American generation was able to give to its children and grandchildren an extreme head start that is still with us today. In fact, today, the typical white family in this country, not the typical rich white family, just the typical right in the middle white family, has about 20 times the net worth of the typical African American family, about 18 times the net worth of the typical Latino family. It is not because we've worked harder, God knows. It is not because we have prayed harder, God certainly knows. And it is not because we as white folks possess some superior investment wisdom about which people of color are lacking. I mean, if you have paid no attention at all to what's happened in the last 5 years on Wall Street, you should at least be able to know this much, that a handful of rich white dudes can lose a hell of a lot of money. And they can do it without any help from black people. They can do it without any help from Latino people, any help from Asian Americans, no Native Americans, just a handful of the richest, smartest, most educated white guys on Wall Street, and they lost approximately $12 trillion of other people's money over the course of about an 18-month period. Think about that. 12 trillion wiped off the books by rich white dudes. If black people stole $12 trillion of other people's money, there would be a congressional investigation. People would be going to jail and prison for long periods of time. That too is the legacy of racism, a differential standard for white folks who break the rules as opposed to people of color who break the rules, you see. That too is part of that legacy. But it wasn't just enslavement that created this inequality. It's also the fact that when the government tried, and it did, for just a brief moment, tried to rectify some of that legacy with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, which were two institutions established in the post-slavery period specifically for the purpose of helping those who had been formerly owned as property to get their own land, their own tools, right, and the ability to start their lives over as free people. It was an effort, if you will, at reparations, although not a huge effort, but still an important one. And yet, the Supreme Court of the United States, within just a few years of the time that those institutions were set up, struck them down, got rid of them, ruled that they were not constitutional. And when they did so, in 1883, one of the Supreme Court justices, Joseph Bradley, made the famous comment that the reason we didn't need to help those who had been formerly enslaved was because it was time for them to stop being the special favorites of the law. The special favorites of the law, as if somehow black folks were being specially favored just because they had a Freedmen's Bureau and a Freedmen's Bank, ignoring the fact that it was actually white Americans who had been the special favorites when they were made citizens and nobody else was, for 200 years going back to the colonial period when they and only they could accumulate property. But Joseph Bradley and his colleagues on the court basically say in 1883, so we're talking, 20 years essentially after emancipation, and only about a decade after these institutions were established to help the former slaves, is basically saying, okay, enough of that. Enough of all that help. And he then said, and this is part of his actual statement, it's time for the Negro to become no longer the special favorite of the laws, but to take his place as a mere citizen, right? Now, keeping in mind that black folks hadn't even been able to be citizens at all up until a few years before this. And you can see the irony in the comment, right? But the point is, when the government tried to do something at the time to deal with this legacy, the Supreme Court struck it down. That's why we're still talking about it. Because when some folks wanted to do right by the newly emancipated peoples and wanted to make sure that they had truly equal opportunity or something at least close to it, the highest court said no, that we couldn't do that. And here we are, 150 years after emancipation, never having taken those steps for more than a handful of years, wondering why we're still having to talk about it. Well, that's why we're still having to talk about it. And of course, in 1862, the very same year that the D.C. Emancipation Act was put into effect, that we're here today to remember, that was the same year that this government passed the Homestead Act. And what was the Homestead Act? The Homestead Act was a law that gave out over 250 million acres of basically free land to white folks. People of color were blocked in almost all cases from being able to obtain that land. And of course, that land had been stolen from native peoples. So this was in every sense a redistribution of resources from people of color to white folks. So the Homestead Act is passed, gives out all of this free land that allows white families to accumulate wealth. That too gets passed down. And so today, the estimates are that there are about 50 million white Americans still living on that land that their ancestors received, or not living on it, but they have benefited from it because it has been sold over those years and the money ultimately stayed in the family. So in some way, 50 million white folks have benefited from this huge government program. Now, if people of color had done that, we would call that a handout. We would call that a welfare program. We would blame the recipients for not wanting to work hard enough for their stuff, because that's what folks say today whenever we talk about something like food support, or we talk about income support, paltry little income support, or housing assistance, or God forbid, a health insurance plan that covers pre-existing conditions. When we talk about those minor things, folks say, well, now that's a handout for the lazy. But when you give out 250 million acres of somebody else's land to white folks so they can have farms and ranches and houses and pass that down to their children, we don't call that a handout. We call that nation building, you see. That's the difference, very different form of analysis. And so today we have these massive inequalities. We see that right here in Washington, D.C. You don't have to look elsewhere to see this inequality, right? You are in a town that has among the highest income gaps between white folk and black folk of any city in this country. We know, for instance, when it comes to unemployment and joblessness, that folks west of the Anacostia River have an unemployment rate under 9%. Even that is too high. Right? But folks who are east of the Anacostia have an unemployment rate of 35%. So we're talking almost 4 times the rate of unemployment between two communities separated by a river. And as you know, it's not a very wide river, right? And yet it is wide enough to mask these huge disparities in opportunity. There is currently, as I'm sure many of you know, a 73-point gap between white and black 8th grade students in Washington, D.C. on math achievement scores. 73 points in terms of proficiency. That's double the national average, which is already bad enough. I mean, if you have a a 36-point gap. That's not acceptable. But in Washington, D.C., it's a 73-point gap, and folks act like there's no way to do anything about that, other than apparently to lower the standards that we expect for folks who are black and folks who are Latino and students who are poor, as if somehow we just don't know how to educate them. But now folks do know how to educate them, because even under segregation, even at a time when black folks were limited to severely underfunded schools, only in their own neighborhoods under Jim Crow segregation, those black educators reached those children. You know, the difference was that those children under segregation knew that those teachers loved them. And those children under segregation knew that those teachers not only loved them, but knew them because they lived in the neighborhood. And they had an interest in seeing to it that all children could learn. Now, that's not to romanticize segregation. It is not to say that those were the good old days, because they were not. But we could learn something from the intentionality of the educators under segregation. Because there's no way that under segregation, those teachers and those principals and those administrators and those school board folks would have allowed a program to come into place that says we're not going to expect the same out of these children as these children. That wouldn't have been allowed under segregation. That would not have been allowed. And yet here we are, not only in Washington, but in other places around the country, saying we're going to hold white folks to this standard and we're going to hold black folks to this standard down here. And the rationale that they give is, well, you know, folks are starting out farther behind, so even if we lower the standard, they still have to make progress faster. And that's true. But ultimately, the message that gets sent when you say to some students, we don't expect you to attain this, we only expect you to attain this, is a presumption of their inferiority. It is a presumption that they just can't cut it, and no matter what we do, they'll never be able to cut it. What kind of message do we want to send to young people, right? Young people who come from communities that have survived enslavement, that have survived segregation, that have survived lynching, that have survived the worst that the world has to offer them. And now we're saying that despite all of that strength that those communities obviously possess, or else they wouldn't have survived those things, despite that, we're just going to throw in the towel. And we're going to say that we can't really expect much more out of these folks. The problem in our schools is not those children. The problem are the tools that we're using to evaluate those children. Giving students all across this country standardized tests, even though they are totally unstandardized schools, unstandardized resources, unstandardized textbooks, unstandardized teacher training. You can't take kids who have been given totally different types of education and then give them one test and call that fair. If you want to give folks a standardized test and then evaluate them on it, you have a moral obligation to standardize the money in those schools and to standardize the training of the teachers in those schools, but we don't do that. We believe in standardizing the punishment. We believe in standardizing the evaluation tools, but we don't believe in standardizing the power and the equality. And that, too, is a legacy of enslavement. Because, see, what the history of enslavement and racism did was not only produce material inequality, it also produced the prejudices themselves that continue to contribute to that material inequality. So think about that. The fact is, at the time that we were enslaving other human beings in this country, and at the time that we were slaughtering in large numbers native people in this country, and at the time that we were taking by force half of Mexico in a war of aggression that this country started on the basis of a lie. And I know that's not what they told us in 8th grade history, but now that's what happened. When all of that was happening, we were at the same time preaching what? Equal opportunity. We were saying out of one side of our mouth that we believed in equality. Out of one side of our mouth, we were saying that we believed that everyone was equal, all men, quote unquote, created equal. Right? But out of the other side of our mouth and in our law and in our practices, we were doing something different. So when you're saying one thing and doing another, you have to figure out how to make that work in your head. You have to figure out how to make those two things combine, because they obviously contradict. And you don't want to be thought of as a hypocrite, so you have to figure out a way to smooth over the contradiction. So how do you do that? If you're saying all men are created equal, but you don't really mean it in practice, the only way that you can make those two things work is to decide that certain people aren't really humans at all. Right? Because if they're not humans, then they're not entitled to equal treatment. And they're not entitled to any consideration. And they're not entitled to any rights. And so that's how the framers and those in the generations after the framers were able to smooth over the contradiction of their rhetoric when combined with the reality of how they treated folks, was to say, well, we didn't really mean those people, right? We didn't mean them. They're not really humans, or in the language of the day, they're not really men. We know they didn't mean women, right? That was obvious. But they didn't mean an awful lot of men either. They basically said, if you're landless, you don't count. If you're a woman, you don't count. If you're black, you certainly don't count. If you're native to this continent, you certainly don't count. If you're anything but white, you don't really count. And so they had to create those prejudices. They had to create that mentality that these people right here are inferior and these people over here are superior. So after a while, several generations of that, right, where you're treating people as inferiors, you're thereby forcing the mindset on people that explains why you treat them that way, and now people start to believe, well, they must be inferior. That's why they're being treated that way. That's why they don't have rights. That's why they are held in bondage. And so several generations of Americans grow up believing fundamentally that people who are black and brown are lesser human beings. And sadly, even some who were black and brown internalize that notion, because when you colonize land, you also colonize this property in one's brain, right? You colonize the mind as well as the land. And so there were always folks who, even under enslavement, people who were held in bondage, who would tell the owner of all those people, who would tell the master on that plantation when a rebellion was going to happen, right? Because even they had bought into the notion of white supremacy. So that notion of white supremacy became very deeply embedded and passed down over the generations. And so now, as a result, we have years of research which tells us that an overwhelming majority of Americans, including large numbers of peoples of color, but certainly large numbers of whites, believe these negative stereotypes about people of color. The same stereotypes that have been around for hundreds of years. That is why I say inertia is not just a property of the physical universe, because not only has the inequality come into the present in terms of money and power, the inequality in terms of mentality, the prejudices have also come into the present. That's why we have those inequalities in the DC schools and in schools all around the country. Because some folk are still operating on the premise that folks are down here because there's something wrong with them, and other folks are up here because they're just that much better. Where did they get that mentality from? They got it from this history that we're trying to remember today. And if we forget that that is its source, we might act as if these prejudices are natural, right? As if these prejudices are normal, but they're not natural. The first time that Europeans came into contact with African peoples, they did not have those beliefs about African peoples yet. When Herodotus, who is considered the father of history by the Greeks, right, and by many in the Western tradition, when he talked about the African kingdoms about which he was familiar, not only Egyptians, but others in Africa, he did not refer to them as inferiors. Now, the Greeks thought everybody that wasn't Greek was inferior, but that's different, right? They didn't think that color meant anything about superiority and inferiority by and large. And so as a result, they had great respect for those African kingdoms. They had great respect for the civilizations that had been built in Africa when, frankly, those of us who were of European descent, Our folks were still running around in the woods, having built nothing yet at the time when those African civilizations first existed. So racism, as we know it, didn't really exist yet. But after you begin to oppress a people, after you begin to subordinate a people, the way that enslavement and genocide did, well, now you have to start creating a new narrative. You have to create a new rhetoric. You have to tell a new story. And that new story is, these people never built anything. These people never had any civilizations. These people weren't even African, right? So by the mid-19th century, mid-1800s, the new line was that the Egyptians, they weren't even real Africans. Forget the fact that they're located in the continent of Africa. Doesn't matter. They're not real Africans. They were light-skinned people, right? Now, in antiquity, that's not the assumption. I mean, the ancient historians had never said that. They knew that Egypt had been a place of all types of colors, right? Dark and light. Some of the kingdoms, some of the pharaohs had been light, some of them had been dark, some had been in between. It was what we would now call a mixed race civilization for thousands of years. But under white supremacy, that had to change and be rewritten. And so now all those white Egyptologists, the Egypt experts by the 1800s and early 1900s had changed their tune. Oh no, black people had no history till we discovered them and then enslaved them. So they are not worthy of consideration. You see, we're still living with that. And that explains why sometimes we are indifferent to the suffering of those at the bottom of our racial hierarchy. That's why we can look at those numbers on educational disparities and still have people go, what are you going to do? It's unfortunate, it's sad, but there's nothing we can do. It's indifference. That's learned indifference. That's not natural. That's not normal. For human beings to be compassionate to one another is what's natural, is what's normal. But when we become indifferent because our history has led us to believe that it's just the way things are, that's why we allow those inequalities to remain. That's why we allow those wealth and unemployment and educational disparities to continue. That's why we don't blink at the data which tells us of the unequal incarceration rates of black and brown folks relative to white folks, particularly for things like drug possession. Right? We know because the data tells us that white folk use drugs just as often, if not more so, than people of color. That white folks sell drugs just as often, if not more so, than people of color. But the stereotypes that are still believed, according to the research, by large numbers of the American people cause us to continue to focus our law enforcement in certain communities and not other communities. I assure you, there are just as many drugs in the dorm rooms over at Georgetown and George Washington University, in the rooms lived in by affluent white college students, as there are on any street corner in Anacostia that you can pick out. And yet we know where the police will be tonight and where the police will not be tonight. And we know who will go to jail tomorrow and who will not go to jail tomorrow. And that is not coincidence. That is the result of this long legacy of white supremacy with which we are still dealing today. But I want to leave you with one thought before I take some questions. And that thought I want to leave you with is this. If we continue to suffer those inequalities gladly, so to speak, or to not suffer them at all in our minds, if we continue to act as if they don't really matter, if we continue to act as if there's nothing we can do, then we are going to be in serious, serious trouble as a country in 20, 25, perhaps 30 years, or perhaps just a few. We are already, I would say, in significant trouble because of these inequalities. But if we continue to allow them to persist, we will all be in trouble, because that indifference has brought us to the point now where we are headed within 25 years for a country that, and you may have heard this, will be approximately half people of color and half white. Now, I know that there are people in this country, particularly some older white folks, who are not happy about that. I know they're very disturbed about that. I know they're very scared that the America that they remember is no more. I understand, right? I know there are some white folks in Arizona, I'm told, in particular, who are very scared about this. But I was in Arizona recently, and I can report to you without any fear of contradiction that the average age of white people in Arizona is about 137 years old, which means that I think we can outlast them. What I mean by that is if those of us who are committed to that new America do the job that we need to do, if those of us who are committed to that new multicultural, multiracial America are willing to fight for it like our lives depend on it, then the fact that there are some folk in the old guard, so to speak, who don't want that day to come won't matter. The future will not belong to them. It will belong to us, but only if we do the work. And understand what happens if we don't do the work. Please understand. Think about it. If we get to that place in 25 years where half of the population are people of color and half are white, and we still have these kinds of inequalities, how are we going to survive as a functional country? If you got half the population twice as likely as the other half to be out of work, 3 times as likely as the other half to be poor, if you've got half the population with 1/20th the net worth of the other half, 1/2 of the population with 9 years less life expectancy than the folks in the other half, 1/2 of the population with double the rate of infant mortality as children in the other half, how is that a recipe for a functional America for anyone's children? This isn't just about black children and brown children. This is about all children, because if we get to that place and we're still this unequal, we are not going to survive as a functional culture, functional society, functional political or economic system. That is a recipe for the destruction of the nation and everything that we care about as a people. Not only the promise of the country, but even whatever progress we have been able to develop up to this point. And so what I say to you is this. Not only must we commemorate our history, both the good and the bad. Not only must we remember it, not only must we memorialize it with, as you do in Washington, D.C., monuments and museums and celebrations of all kinds, but we have to memorialize it in our actions. We have to commit ourselves, not only in theory, but in practice, to the coming of equality in this country, because we have never been the nation we have claimed to be, not for 1 minute, not for 1 hour, not for 1 day. But that does not mean that we do not have the potential to be that place we were told about in the history books. We have that potential, but only if we are prepared to do the work and to do it fearlessly and to do it without apology and to demand that we learn from that past as we move forward into the future. Thank you all so much for being here today with me and for allowing me to be here with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I would love to take a few questions. And then we're going to move into really the exciting part of this for me and for many of you will be the awards program. But before we do that, I would love to take a few questions from the audience if you have any. So feel free to, yes.
We have a question over here. This may not be in your basket, but I don't know if you've done any studies in specific about deaf persons.
Well,
who were slaves.
I do not have a historical grounding in the historical treatment of enslaved persons who were deaf, although I think that would be and is a really fascinating and important area for study. And if anyone has done some of that research here in this room, I would love to be made aware of it because it is critically important. I can say that one thing that I do know from just my time on this earth and experiencing the way that privilege works, whether it is white privilege, whether it is male privilege, whether it is economic privilege, straight privilege, or hearing privilege, is that all of these things tend to operate in a way that allows the people who have them to be oblivious to the lived reality of those who don't and suffer no consequence. And so the important thing about your question to me is that the fact that I have not had to know anything about the specific experience of enslaved persons who were deaf says something, not just about my white privilege as a white person who doesn't have to know much about enslavement, but as a hearing person who need not know anything in this society about the experiences of the deaf, because I won't be punished for that ignorance, right? And that is part of our problem. Part of our problem is that that history is not part of the history that we all learn. And so we need to make sure that that is part of the history, because too oftentimes it is ignored. And as a result, I can be 44 years old and never have been exposed to the very specific and important area of history that you mentioned. And I think that is another lesson about how privilege operates. Not only white privilege, but in this case, hearing privilege as well. So thank you for the question. Other questions? Great.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. You had talked a lot about privileges that white people have and within the system, and that it's institutionalized into our society. But how do we teach for change? How do we work within the system or work outside of the system in order to affect change? How do we make these rich white dudes on the street responsible?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I would love to, be able to tell you that I have the secret silver bullet answer to that question. I don't, but I can say this. It seems to me that the first step in addressing the system and the first step in addressing other persons who are part of that system and maybe don't realize that they are or don't understand what that means for other people is we have to start with truth. And I think, unfortunately, what we've done in our schools and what we've done in our religious institutions and what we've done in the workplace and certainly what we've done in our politics is that we have run from the truth like a disease. We've run from having honest conversations because we're too afraid that if we have an honest conversation, people's feelings will get hurt. And I understand that. I'm someone who, in spite of being white, grew up in a family with very little money. So I certainly understand those white folks who say, well, I don't have white privilege because I wasn't rich. But those are two really somewhat separate issues. I understand the difference between my economic position, which was low growing up, and my racial position, which was very high. Now, is it fun for me to think about that? No. Did I enjoy being told that the first time that I was told that by someone who said I really should think about it? No, I didn't like it. But what I came to recognize was that unless I dealt with that honestly for myself, I wasn't going to be able to be much use to the larger movement for social justice. If I hadn't done my own work, if I hadn't really processed my own history. So one of the things I think we can do in our classrooms and as often as possible in our neighborhoods and our communities is make sure that we're telling our story, and that means getting clear on what our stories are. I think a lot of times we don't think about, those of us who are white, we don't think about the role that race has played in our lives. And so when these conversations come up, we feel like we don't have anything to really talk about. People of color know that they do because they know that race, has played a role in their life. And so they have a narrative, they have a story to tell. And of course we do too, it's just we're not used to telling it. The same thing is true for men when we talk about sexism. It's very easy for men to think that's a woman's issue, so we'll let women deal with it. But if it's an issue for women, it must be an issue for us. You can't have a down without an up, You can't have one group subordinated and another group not be elevated. And so we have to be honest, not so that we can feel guilty, but so that we can take responsibility for the legacy that we've inherited. And I think strategically, the important thing about starting with yourself and telling your own stories first whenever you're in those, classroom settings or small group settings or one-on-one conversations, is that it takes a little bit of the fear out of the room, right? Because if I'm talking to a small group of people and I'm talking about their white privilege, you can imagine that if it's a small group, it can be sort of threatening because they think that I'm sort of judging them, right? It's almost as if I'm saying, well, I'm the good white person and you're the bad white people. And that's not at all a helpful message, right? Because like I said, the research says we've all internalized this mess. The research says we all have some of this in us. So it isn't about good people and bad people. It's about people growing up in a culture that allows us to internalize these biases and rarely ever be called on them. So if I start with my story, and if you start with your stories around race, around gender, around sexuality, around economics, around deaf culture, and vis-a-vis the hearing community, those are stories that resonate because they're personal. Those are stories that allow people to hear you as another individual human being and not as a lecturer, right? Which is different. It's one thing to stand up here in front of a few hundred people and give a lecture. That's different because it's not personal. It doesn't feel personal the same way it would if we were in a room, me and like 4 of you, and I was just going off. You'd be like, what the hell is he doing? Why is he doing that? It's sort of scaring me now, But if it's a big group, it's one thing. If it's a small group, you start small. You start personal, and then that encourages other people to tell their stories, because if you've told yours, they don't feel as likely that you're going to jump them when they tell theirs, right? If I admit my own privileges, then it's safe for you to acknowledge yours, right? Because you know that when you do that, I'm not going to yell at you. I just admitted that I had them, right? So now it's safe for us to have an honest conversation about our biases, about our privileges, about how we may have benefited from various forms of inequality. So I think strategically that's where we start, is we try to start with ourselves and connect to other people on that level first before we try to do some of the bigger picture stuff that I think is necessary, but which is not likely to happen until we do some of the personal piece. A couple other questions.
I think we don't have much time left. We have about 5 minutes at this point.
Okay.
We're just trying to make sure. We have about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So we'll just have this this last question.
Okay.
Just trying to decide which question is going to be the last one.
Okay.
Thank you for coming to present today. It's kind of two-part. I know we talk about individuals with privilege to take responsibility, but how do you get individuals within those communities to take responsibility for our actions and what we do within community? And then secondly, I know when Bill Cosby came out with his book, is he right in regards to African Americans not necessarily as a community rising, but maybe individuals within that community rising above poverty and maybe some of the social economic issues that we have? What is your view on this comment?
Well, I think I'm a father, right? So as a father, the whole concept of people taking personal responsibility for themselves appeals to me, because I got 2 little kids who do crazy things like kids do. And so I am big on making sure that they know that they have to be personally responsible for their actions. I don't let them off the hook for much. So I expect them to work hard. I expect them to do their best. And I expect that of them, even though as women, they are going to be subjected, and I know this as a matter of certainty, to sexism at some point, and oftentimes many points throughout their life. So the sexism is not an excuse for them not to work hard, but now it is something about which I want to make them aware. Because if I don't make them aware of it, then I'm not preparing them for the world as it is. If all I were to do was to say, don't let that bother you, just work hard, I'm not preparing them for what that really means and what that looks like. So I think it's not that Bill Cosby's right or wrong, it's just that I think sometimes that rhetoric of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and don't let those things get in your way is simplistic, right? The fact is, those are not excuses, those are reasons for inequality. They are real. They are actual barriers. And to act like they aren't there doesn't make them go away. You know, if I were to say to my daughters, well, you know, and I've had people tell me, you shouldn't tell your daughters about sexism. That will make them afraid. That will make them neurotic. That will make them, you know, afraid of their own shadows, and they'll think of themselves as victims. But now, what's the alternative? I don't tell them about it. And then it's like sending them down a dark alley, and at the end of that alley is an electric fence. And Daddy didn't tell them because I didn't want to freak them out, you know. Didn't want to make them neurotic, so I just neglected to tell them, oh yeah, by the way, at the end of the alley, there's this fence, and if you hit it, it will electrocute you. Sorry, I forgot to tell you that, right? And that would make me a pretty bad father. So it's both and, right? It's personal and collective responsibility. And that's what it's always been. I mean, you can't name a group in this country that has done more to try to take personal responsibility for itself than black folk, right? Because historically, African-descended peoples knew that nobody was going to help. Like that was understood. So black folks knew they had to stick together and do it themselves. There's no community that has done more of that self-help historically in this country than black people. And yet we still have folks who act like somehow self-help is a new concept to black people. I mean, that can only be believed by two groups of people. White folks who don't know any black people and don't spend any time in black communities, or, and I mean no disrespect by saying this, folks like Mr. Cosby who have not been around poor black people for a very, very long time. And as a result, maybe, you know, when you make a lot of money, maybe it's like Will Smith after the election of Barack Obama said, you know, I like Obama because it proves that we have no more excuses. Well, I guess when you make 20 million a film, it's very easy for you to think that other folks who don't are just making excuses. But now, you know, there's a Will Smith who came out of West Philly, right, who probably had a different take on that before he made it big and understood that his hard work alone also needed some luck, also needed some connections, also needed good timing. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into making a person a superstar or even just a successful business person or a successful social worker or a successful teacher or psychologist or doctor or whatever it is. And so I think with regard to Bill Cosby's comments and what the responsibility of marginalized peoples are, those responsibilities are real. Everybody has an obligation to do the best that they can. That's what makes life livable, is trying to do your best. But as we are asking people to do that, and as we are expecting them to do that, whether it's other people or ourselves, other people's children or our children, we should also be stressing that we want to meet folks halfway and say, you do 100%, I'll do 100%. You do 100% and we'll meet you right in the middle and we'll do it. We're not going to do 50 and have you do 50, right? That, if you were playing doubles tennis, you wouldn't say to your partner, well, now you're going to give 50%? Cool, I'll give 50%, right? You would say, no, you give 100% and I'll give 100%. And that's what we're really talking about, is having the community say, these are our obligations. That doesn't mean you don't have yours. It just means we have to do these things together. And so inequality is not an excuse for a lack of effort, but by the same token, inequality cannot become an excuse for our own indifference. And my fear is that we're farther over in that direction than the other direction, and that's something we need to address. Thank you all again so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Are we ready for the awards?
Stephanie, yes, I know you guys are just so excited and waiting to get your awards.
Okay, is everyone ready? When we were first invited to participate in this contest for the emancipation, one of the things that we were asked to do was to participate and have the students from the middle school and high school. And we have 3 categories for students within which to participate. One was Amos Kendall. And the reason why that was a category was because he was postmaster at the time when the emancipation happened. The second category was deaf slaves, and the third category is deaf slave owners. So there were 3 different ways that students could participate, and the first way that they could participate was by creating posters. The second is multimedia, film, and the third way was through writing. And so our first place prize, or the 3 first place prizes for all 3 categories, first place for the poster goes to, and actually let me back up here, everyone gets the iPad for first place. Okay, so those who have first place get an iPad. Those who are in second place get a trophy and a certificate. And third place winners get a certificate. And if I could ask each student, as I call your name, to come up here and receive your award and then remain on the stage, because we'd like to have a group photograph. And also, all of the posters are on display outside in this reception area, so please take an opportunity to look at them. First place winner is Chanice Cole for a poster. Oh, Shanice Cole. C-H-A-N-I-C-E for the cart. The second place winner is Markea Howard.
Unfortunately, she is not here today. She had a special appointment, but I will receive the award on her behalf.
That's M-A-R-K-E-A, Howard. Third place, Yolanda Ford, 4 posters. And within each category, we also developed a rubric for scoring the winners. And that was based on quality of presentation. It was also based on relevance to the theme. As well as creativity, educational values, and originality. Students could not get help for the work, so they did it on their own, and I think it was really important to recognize that. We received a total of 11 posters that were submitted. For videos, we received 6 videos, and all of the videos were phenomenal. It was very hard to choose. So first place goes to Yesenia Garcia, Y-E-S-E-N-I-A.
Congratulations.
Second place for film goes to Elias Asafia, E-L-I-Y-A-S-A-S-S-E-F-A.
Congratulations.
And third place for film goes to Chen, Zhencheng, last name Chen. For our essays, we had asked our students to write about deaf slaves and any information they could find with that. They couldn't find any information. And so the committee asked them to write about what they imagine it would have been like to have been a deaf slave. And so the essays were based on that. And they were beautiful stories. And our first place winner is Jenida Willoughby, Jennida Willoughby. Second place winner is Diana Mendez Leon. And we'd like to take an opportunity to, oops, I'm sorry, I missed one. Because we had the rubric for judging, one poster did not meet all of the criteria for the posters, but it was a beautiful piece of art, so we gave them a certificate for honorable mention, and that student is Miguel Brehm, Brehm.
The card didn't spell my name right. I wanted to make sure. Okay, they did spell my name right, so I'm happy about that.
So MSSD and Kendall School staff helped us make this happen for all of the students. So thank you to everyone who participated.